This morning we'll be reading from Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Jesus told his disciples, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be a manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses.' So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' 900 gallons of olive oil,' he replied. The manager told him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, 'And how much do you owe?' 1,000 bushels of wheat,' he replied. He told him, 'Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Please be seated.
Again, as Brennan shared at the beginning of the service, if you are a guest of ours today, we are thrilled to have you with us. We pray that you'll be able to stay around, if not for our entire Bible class hour following our worship assembly, at least long enough to give us the opportunity to introduce ourselves to you, to find out a little about you, and we hope that you will join us again for worship and study here at the Broken Arrow Church. We're continuing on Sunday mornings our study from the Gospel of Luke, and this is a series that, granted, has gone on for quite a while now. We've got a ways to go since we're only in chapter 16. We are punctuating that with a different study on Life Group Sundays, and just a reminder, Life Groups will be meeting next Sunday afternoon and evening, and so if you would please contact the office by Wednesday of this week, let us know the time of your meeting, the place of your meeting, so we can print that in the insert next Sunday. But I'm grateful to have this additional opportunity this morning to deal with this text from Luke chapter 16. Since chapter 9, verse 51, we found Jesus on a journey, and his destination is Jerusalem. In fact, chapter 9, verse 51 says that Jesus resolutely set his face to go to Jerusalem. And for some reason, newer English translations completely ripped that beautiful word picture out, that powerful word picture, as if we wouldn't understand what it means to set your face to go somewhere. And it just says Jesus determined to go to Jerusalem. Jesus decided to go, which it was a determination, it was a decision, but he got radar lock on Jerusalem. He set his face there, and nothing was going to distract him, nothing was going to deter him, nothing was going to stop him from reaching that destination. But Luke continues to tell us about things that happened along the way. Healings that took place, teaching that took place. And Jesus is teaching everyone who will listen, and they fall into three categories primarily. There are the committed. Those are the disciples, the ones who have already made a decision, who have left everything and followed Jesus. And it's to the disciples that he will address the parable that we're discussing this morning that Bruce just read for us. So there's the committed, there's the curious. That's the larger crowd of people. They've heard about Jesus. They have some interest in him. Not quite sure what to make of him, but they're willing to listen. And in addition to the committed and the curious, you've got the critical. And he will address them as well. In fact, that's who the last parable, threefold parable, was directed toward. In Luke chapter 15, our discussion last week, this threefold parable about the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost son, or the lost sons, depending on how you want to view the parable, that is directed not toward the disciples, not just toward the curious, but to the critics. The critics being the Pharisees and the scribes who questioned him as to why he received tax collectors and sinners and why he ate with them. So he told them this parable, singular, in 3 parts. But now he turns his attention to his disciples once again. Chapter 16, verse 1, he was also saying to the disciples. Why is that important? Because he's talking to us. This is a message for his church. It was relevant for his disciples even before that church was established. It hasn't lost any relevance in the 2,000 intervening years. And so if there are sections of Scripture that you want to nod off on, if there are sections of Scripture, if you get bogged down in Leviticus in your daily Bible readings and wonder, exactly how's this going to help me on Wednesday, I can understand that. But when it says Jesus said this to his disciples, that's our signal to pay extra special attention, because this was for the people who had decided to follow in his steps, just as we have. This happens to be a parable that's not one that we focus as much on. It's not such a beautiful story as the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son. It's a problematic parable because it raises potentially some issues in some people's minds. And it's led to a variety of interpretations, not only of what Jesus is describing within the story itself, but what he meant by it. The application. Why did Jesus tell this parable to the disciples? As I was reviewing one particular commentary this past week, a rather exhaustive, actually it wasn't a commentary on Luke, it was just a book on parables, a very big book on parables, so it's very detailed and it was very thoroughly researched. And this particular scholar listed 16 different interpretations, not just across the theological spectrum out there, 16 different interpretations that have come from conservative, Bible-believing scholars who look for different nuances. They see different messages there. So what are my chances of getting the right one out of the 16? I don't know. If I miss it this morning, Barrett Van Landingham's going to be with us on Wednesday night, August the 14th, and he can have a crack at that one too in our Wednesday night summer series on the parables. He's going to be talking about this same story. One writer said that some interpreters seem to be embarrassed by the parable, what they think it might be communicating, and so they have to find some other way to explain it, some other way to apply it rather than the way that it most naturally reads. While I'll be briefly mentioning a couple of alternative views this morning, I want to present what I feel is the most natural interpretation of the text, one that should not create does not create any moral dilemmas for us within the teaching of the Lord. So like all the parables, we have a rather simple story with easy to relate to characters and so forth. And this one begins by mentioning a rich man. And normally, this would be a signal that this was somehow going to be the bad guy, going to be the villain, because typically rich people don't fare well in the teaching of Jesus. Sort of like in the book of Genesis, the firstborn doesn't fare very well. Even though, according to the law that comes later, the firstborn's going to have special blessings, special privileges, Cain doesn't do so well. Ishmael doesn't do so well as compared to Isaac. Esau doesn't do so well. Reuben doesn't do so well. Manasseh doesn't do so well compared to his younger brother Ephraim. And so in Genesis, you had this standing on its head of this concept of the blessing of the firstborn. Firstborn kind of strikes out very often in the book of Genesis, as the rich do in the teaching of Jesus. Back in chapter 6, verse 24, "Woe to you who are rich, for you are receiving your comfort in full." That is, enjoy it while you got it. Live it up in the here and now, because though your bank account might be full, your heart seems to be empty in your relationship with God. And he will address that in the parable in chapter 12. The rich fool. I believe Mike shared the lesson on that particular text back several months ago. This man who has bumper crops, he's got big barns but not big enough, and so he's going to tear them down. He's going to have it made for the rest of his life, but he's bankrupt as far as a relationship with God. So he's called a fool by the Lord. because he hasn't stored up any riches toward God at all. In Luke chapter 14, a couple of weeks ago, we discussed this passage where Jesus challenges the rich not to just invite their well-to-do friends and neighbors and relatives who can return the favor, who can invite them over to a banquet, and so you just have this supper club, this social club that rotates where they eat and where they meet, and the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind are marginalized and neglected and ignored. He chastises them for extending good only to those who can respond in kind. Later in this chapter, probably our next discussion from Luke, we'll talk about a poor man named Lazarus, and we'll talk about a rich man, and how the story reads at the beginning with this man seeing to his own lavish comfort, but neglects the suffering and the needs of this man outside his gate, later finds himself in torment after death. And then when we get to Luke chapter 18, we'll come across this guy that from composite pictures that we get in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call him the rich young ruler. And you know the story there. So tied to his wealth, so devoted to his wealth, so shackled and enslaved by it that he can't let it go. If that's what it takes to follow Jesus, he's not willing to pay that price. And so he goes away sorrowfully. In this story, the rich man gets to be neutral. He serves as the introduction to the story, which really focuses on the rich man's manager. This is probably not a slave or a servant. Often the parables of Jesus will describe servants or slaves. This man is undoubtedly a free man. He is undoubtedly an employee because his mismanagement doesn't result in punishment. It results in dismissal. It results in being fired from his position. And I don't know how long, again, as Matt Crane in his wonderful lesson on the parables on this past Wednesday night, the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee praying in Luke chapter 18. You know, several times in that lesson, Matt reminded us, and just remember this is a parable. These weren't two real guys that Jesus saw praying in the temple, and sometimes we have to remind ourselves about the other parables as well. So we might imagine how long this guy has had that position, how long he's had the job, but remember it is a story that Jesus is putting together to teach this point. But you might imagine that he has been in the position for a while, and it comes to the rich man's attention that his manager has been guilty of gross neglect. His assets have been wasted. He has squandered his possessions. The New American Standard Bible reads squandered, NIV, wasting his possessions. It's the same word that appears back in chapter 15, verse 13, describing what the young son does after he gets his share of the father's inheritance and he goes to the far country. There he wastes it, literally. The Greek verb means he scattered it, just threw it away. It's the same word that's used here to describe the steward's mismanagement. So at a minimum, this is gross mismanagement and irresponsibility. At a maximum, maybe it's outright fraud and embezzlement that has caused the rich man's assets to diminish so greatly. And so he calls the manager to him and tells him that he's going to lose his job, but they're going to have a meeting first. You need to bring the books. I need to examine the records. And so the manager knows that the die is cast. He can't keep his position any longer. And then he begins to reason about his future. For all of his dishonesty in regard to other things, he's brutally honest about himself and to himself and with himself. This is a white-collar position. He has been in upper management. He hasn't been picking olives to make the oil. He hasn't been sowing and cultivating and harvesting the wheat. He has overseen these operations that have been handled primarily by sharecroppers, those who would owe the owner his share from the produce. So it's been a long time since he's broken a sweat. It's been a long time since he's gotten any dirt under his fingernails. And in just brutal honesty and transparency, he says, you know, I'm too lazy and I'm too weak to do any kind of physical labor, can't dig. And despite that, I'm still too proud to beg, I may be weak, but it doesn't mean I don't have any self-image. And so I can't really work. I'm not going to beg. So what am I going to do? And at this point, in this dilemma, he has this stroke of worldly genius that ensures that he's going to have somewhere to go. He's going to have some means of support after he loses his job. So he calls his master's debtors together. And while a rich man would have had many debtors, probably many sharecroppers who worked his land, Jesus just describes two of them as examples for us, gives us a description to give us an idea of the ingenuity of this steward's plan. The first one owed 100 measures of oil, olive oil. Newer translations, the New American Standard sticks with 100 measures, which doesn't help us very much. Some translations say 800 gallons. I noticed, Bruce, what were you reading from the NIV this morning? You don't know? I don't know either. Anyway, it said 900 gallons. And what he does is he has the man write in his own hand, cutting that debt in half to 450 gallons, or if it was 800 gallons, cutting it to 400 gallons. Second debtor is told to change his debt from 100 measures of wheat to 80 measures. Newer translations, again, will go with about 1,000 bushels, lowering it 20%. Unlike the 50% reduction before, this is a 20% reduction to 800 bushels. Now, some commentators just can't handle the fact that Jesus is describing somebody doing this that's going to be praised later. And so they've got to find some way to explain it other than what it just simply looks like. So they'll say, well, all he was doing was removing from their bill the punitive interest that, according to the law of Moses, shouldn't have been there in the first place. Or he's removing his commission, his cut from it. So just take my commission off of your bill. You don't owe that anymore. That's really nice, but wrong. That's really intriguing, but unnecessary. This guy is sharp. He's not just taking off punitive interest. He's not just removing his commission. And if I read the story correctly, he's making the debtors accomplices because he doesn't take their bills and change them. He says, you write 400 gallons instead of 800 gallons. You write 800 bushels instead of 1,000 bushels. And so in the event that they don't show the kind of appreciation later than that they should have, if they're not ready to welcome him when he's out of a job, he can threaten to expose their complicity in the fraud that would again make them liable for the larger debt, and he would have the leverage of blackmail to hold over their heads because it's in your hand. You changed your bill to read like it does. So when the manager later meets back up with the owner, with the rich man easily figures out what's happened. Somebody has cooked the books, and he knows who did the cooking. It's his manager, and he praises his steward not for his dishonesty, not for his theft, certainly not for the losses, additional losses that he has incurred, but for his shrewdness. Leon Morris in his commentary writes, it's the astuteness of the steward which is commended, not his commercial practices, not his dishonesty, not his fraud. What this guy did was demonstrate under dire circumstances in a crisis situation, he demonstrates decisive action. And he has, from a worldly point of view, this stroke of genius from a purely strategic standpoint. It's kind of like watching an old classic movie, and the younger people won't even have any idea who these actors are, probably. But, if you go back and watch Paul Newman and Robert Redford in The Sting, or you read an account of an elaborate jewelry heist, or an unbelievable bank robbery that takes place, intellectually, cognitively, you know that this is unacceptable, immoral, not to mention illegal behavior that's going on. But you kind of have to grin and say, wow, what a plan. What a scheme. How did they ever come up with that? How did they work out all of the timing, the coordination, the execution of the plan? How did they ever pull that off? And this owner, this rich man, who's already lost enough through the initial mismanagement, has now even lost more by the reduction of the debts. All he's left to do is shake his head and say, "You clever rascal. You clever rascal. I thought I had you. I had you caught. I was dismissing you. All I needed was the books. And now that I look at the books, I see exactly how shrewd you were." The point of Jesus in following up in verse 8 is, the end of verse 8, "For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light." Who are the sons of this age and who are the sons of light? It's fairly clear from Scripture. The sons of this age are the people of this world. Men and women who have no particular interest in acknowledging or serving God, no particular claim of faith in Jesus Christ. The view that this life is pretty much all there is. You only go around once, so go for the gusto, get all you can, no matter how you have to get it. Those are the sons and daughters of this age. We are the children of light. According to Jesus in John chapter 12, verse 36, "While you have the light, believe in the light, so that you may become sons of light." Ephesians chapter 5, verse 8, "For you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light." And what Jesus said was a challenge to His disciples then, and I think it's just as much of a challenge to us today as children of light. God's Word translation has that latter part of verse 8 as follows: "Worldly people are more clever than spiritually minded people when it comes to dealing with others." Basically, Jesus is saying the people of this world are often so much better at what they do than the sons of light are. The world is often much better at being the world than we are in being the church. F.F. Bruce writes, "You see," said Jesus, "worldly people with no thoughts beyond this present life will sometimes behave more sensibly and providently than people who are otherworldly, the children of light. They will use material wealth to prepare for their earthly future. Why cannot the children of light use it to prepare for their eternal future?" What if the sons and daughters of light, what if we were as effective in getting the message of Christ to this world as effectively and thoroughly and powerfully as Coke and McDonald's and Walmart have in getting their message, in getting their business? How much more important is kingdom business than that, and yet how poorly we compare sometimes in taking the message of truth. See, 2013, 2014. Next year will be 30 years ago that I was on about a 6-week campaign in Papua New Guinea, and we were based in Port Moresby, the capital, doing most of our evangelistic work around there, but we ended up scattering, the team did, into different groups. The small group that I was with flew over the mountains to Leh. It's the first place I met Willie Franklin. Willie and Pam were still serving there in Leh, and I went with a Canadian missionary way up into the highlands to a little village called Kapini. This is 1984. This is 30 years ago almost. We stayed and we taught, preached every night in Kapini, and just up the road several miles was the district capital, which was just a little larger village called Mimyamya. But there was an airstrip at Mimyamya. And the local magistrate was reported to be flying back in a small single-engine plane. He was being flown from Port Moresby across the mountains to the little landing strip there at Mimyamya, which is just, you've got sheer mountain cliffs on every side, and you got this cleared airstrip, and so the plane's literally got to drop out of the sky, to hit this landing strip. So when people heard that a plane was coming in, they would come and gather around, and there were people with very primitive tools and weapons. In fact, I bought a stone axe off of a guy. It's in my office now. Had to whittle the handle off to get it in my suitcase. I measured and whittled it at the point that I could fit it diagonally in there, but that stone axe is still in my office. And there were men standing around literally with bones through their noses, through their ears, through their lips. And it was really hot, really humid, and we were standing there waiting to see if we could spot this plane come over the mountains and then just drop to hit this airstrip. And there was a little shack. That's all there was at the airstrip. No terminal, just a little shack. And one of the guys on the team came out and said, there's a guy in there who's got a kerosene refrigerator, and he's selling Cokes. And so we went in there, and sure enough, I don't know how long it's been since you had a Coke out of a bottle, an ice-cold Coke out of a bottle. We thought we were at the end of the earth, and, we paid the guy the money. I didn't have the exact change, and he didn't have the proper coins to give me the change that I needed back. So while I'm holding, in my hand this freezing bottle of Coke, he sets up 2 pieces of grape bubble gum as my change on the purchase. And then I go back and stand next to the guy with the bones, all through his face. And it was just the most surreal thing, I thought I was at the jumping off place. You can't get further away from civilization than here. Coke got there way before I did. Bubble Yum got there way before I did. Jesus said, if people in this world can be so materially focused toward their worldly wealth, why can't we be spiritually focused toward it? And we will if our attitude and use of worldly wealth is what it should be. It might even help us be received into eternal dwellings, into an eternal home. And it was interesting to go back and look about what Jesus has said about wealth in chapter 6 and chapter 14 and what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 6. And it not only talks about our use of worldly wealth, but the connection between how we use what we have in this world and our eternal destiny. Luke chapter 6, verses 31 through 35, treat others the same way you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back the same amount. But you love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And what? And your reward will be great. And you will be sons of the Most High, for He Himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men. Back in chapter 14, that we noticed a couple of weeks ago, he also went on to say to the one who had invited him, he says this to his host, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors. Otherwise, they may also invite you in return, and that will be your repayment. But when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Notice how he connects our attitude toward and our use of worldly wealth with the outcome of the resurrection for us. And then 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. Use worldly wealth with eternity in mind. Jesus said, in the big picture, your use of wealth is just one of the little things where true faithfulness and wisdom are shown. If you can't use worldly wealth for the glory of God and for eternal purposes, how can you expect to have greater things entrusted to you, true riches, spiritual riches? And he says, bring the same kind of attitude, the same kind of mindset that this unrighteous steward did. Who causes his master to just shake his head and say, you clever rascal, I never would have thought of that. I never would have figured that out. I had PowerPoint problems getting ready for the lesson today, and if it had not had the glitch, at this point I would have shared, and it was just a picture of a Charms blow pop, was all it was. And I was going to put that picture up there because that's what I perceive myself looking like to people who come for help. You know, I'm the sucker. I think they just see, you know, the physical form of a sucker when they look at me. Because they know I'll believe just about any story, you know, they've got. And I've heard some really good stories. And every time I think I've heard the best one, you know, I haven't. And a few times I've just been left thinking, not only have I been defrauded, and maybe the church treasury been defrauded, but wow, what a scheme. You know, what a plan. A few years back at McDermott Road, Rhonda Cabral, this was a Friday, this guy came in and started telling me this story, and ended up talking to him for about 2.5 hours. We studied the Bible together. I was expecting him Sunday morning to be there, and I was going to hear his confession of Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and you know, was going to have the opportunity to baptize him into Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of his sins. Just in the interim, he needed a little help, you know, to bridge the gap between then and Sunday, but he was going to be there. And I think I gave him $100. We helped him some from the church, got him set up in a hotel, and he wasn't there Sunday morning. And I thought, well, maybe he got hung up. He'll be at the second service. He wasn't at the second service. He wasn't at the evening service. I went to the hotel the next Monday morning, and the hotel manager was wanting me to pay for the 2 nights that the guy had skipped out on. I said, look, you know, I'll take the blame for losing my $100 and the church's money, but, you know, you're on your own there. But I had told Rhonda on Friday after he left, after I got back from taking him to the hotel, I said, if that guy's lying to me, he's the best I've ever seen. And on Monday, I told her he was the best I've ever seen. You know, I totally believable. And if people in this world can be that ingenious, that astute, that shrewd in doing what they do, how much more should the people of God be? Regarding chapter 6, verse 12, where Jesus says, if you've not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? Hendrickson writes, what's stressed here is that what we fondly call our money, our house, our bonds, our stocks, our bank certificates, etc., is not really our own. It's just a trust handed to us to use in such a manner that God can be pleased. So Jesus says, in regard to earthly wealth, use it, and use it well, or it will use you. Master it, and master it well, or it will master you. Notice Jesus didn't say, you must not serve God in wealth. It's not what he says. He says you cannot serve God in wealth. It's impossible. You know, we're blessed with a lot of both ands in life, where we don't have to make a choice. We're not backed into a corner where we have to choose one over the other. This isn't one of those things. We have to make a choice. He says you cannot serve God in wealth. And he says, he who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And I just want to challenge us as we go out this week, not only to be thinking about how shrewd and ingenious and bold and daring and fearless we need to be in seeking to fulfill Christ's will for His church, but to listen to Jesus' words, to be as shrewd as serpents but as harmless as doves, and to be conscious of showing faithfulness to our God in the little things this week. Stewardship in the little things. Do we give from our first fruits to the Lord, or do we tithe from the top, or do we scrape together what's left from the bottom of our income in our gifts and our offerings to the Lord? Do we use our material blessings only for our own comfort and needs, or also for the needs of others? We need to show compassion and service in the little things. Kindness, courtesy, and compassion in our words and our actions toward strangers, toward the people with whom we work, to the people that we go home to at the end of the day, toward the members of our spiritual family. Honesty and integrity in the little things, especially in the little things. If we'll lie about the little things, there's little hope that we'll show integrity in regard to the big things. He who is faithful in very little will be faithful also in much. In regard to little things and big things, I remind you as we close that God has done the big things for us. when it comes to salvation. He's the one who allowed His Son to die on our behalf. And what He asks in return, while there is a cost of discipleship, what He asks in return is so small compared to what He has done in the big thing of the sacrifice of Christ. I would ask you this morning to be faithful in those little things, to be faithful in your acknowledgement of Jesus Christ as the Son of God, to be faithful in your confession of Him as God's Son, and you're turning from sin. Be faithful, accept, submit, obey, and being united with Christ in baptism. If there are other things, little things or big, that you want to share with the church family this morning, the shepherds of the congregation await to accept you, receive you, and pray with you as we stand and sing.